Some people say grief fades with time, but what they don't tell you is that for some, grief doesn't fade. It becomes the only thing left. Maya hadn't slept through the night in 6 months. Not since the phone call, not since the police officer's voice cracked when he said the words didn't survive the impact. Not since her entire world collapsed in the time it took her heart to break into pieces so small she wasn't sure they could ever be put back together. At 3 a.m, when the rest of the city dreamed peacefully behind locked doors and drawn curtains, Maya sat cross-legged on her apartment floor, surrounded by photographs of the only 2 people who had ever truly known her. Her parents, her mother's smile, frozen in time at last year's Christmas dinner, her father's laugh, captured mid-joy at her graduation, and Maya, alive in every single photo, never knowing that being alive would one day feel like the cruelest punishment of all. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional siren wailing in the distance, but inside Maya's head, the noise was deafening. The same thoughts, looping endlessly, like a scratched record, she couldn't stop playing. If only I had been in the car. If only I had insisted on driving them home. If only I hadn't stayed behind to help clean up after the wedding. Survivor's guilt, her friend Sarah called it, as if naming it would somehow make it smaller, more manageable, less suffocating. But guilt doesn't shrink when you name it. It grows. It feeds on your silence, your isolation, your 3 a.m. vigils with ghosts you can't let go of. 6 months ago, Maya's parents had owned a small neighborhood bakery, the kind of place where regulars knew each other's names, and the smell of fresh bread greeted you like an old friend every single morning. Maya had grown up in that bakery, doing homework at the corner table while her father kneaded dough and her mother decorated cakes with the precision of an artist. It had been her second home, her safe place, the foundation of everything good in her life. Now the bakery sat dark and empty, its windows dusty, its ovens cold, its door locked with a chain Maya couldn't bring herself to remove. She had inherited it along with the life insurance money, the house, and the suffocating weight of expectations she couldn't meet. Everyone kept telling her how lucky she was, how her parents had left her set up for life, how they'd be so proud if she reopened the bakery and carried on their legacy. But luck felt like a sick joke when you were 25 years old, and eating cereal for dinner because cooking for one felt like admitting you were truly alone. Maya went through the motions of living because she didn't know what else to do. She'd taken a mindless temp job filing papers in a corporate office where no one asked personal questions, and she didn't have to pretend to be okay. She declined every invitation from friends who still tried to reach her, their concern eventually turning to frustration, then to silence. She smiled politely at strangers and nodded at appropriate moments in conversations she wasn't really part of. She was a ghost haunting her own life. Present, but not really there. Breathing, but not really living. And the only person who hadn't given up on her was Sarah, her best friend since college, who called every day and showed up unannounced with takeout Maya barely touched and movies Maya barely watched. On a rainy Thursday evening in late autumn, Sarah sat across from Maya in that same apartment, watching her best friend stare blankly at a muted television screen, and something inside her finally snapped. "I can't watch you disappear anymore," Sarah said, her voice cracking with desperation that had been building for months. Maya didn't respond, didn't even blink. And that's when Sarah did something she'd been planning for weeks, but had been too afraid to suggest. She pulled out a flyer from her bag, bright orange paper announcing a grief support group at the local community center, meeting every Thursday evening at 7. "You're going," Sarah said, not asked. And when Maya started to shake her head, started to retreat behind that wall of polite refusal she'd perfected. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Please, Maya, just once, just try. Because I'm losing you, and I don't know how to save you, and I need you to want to be saved." The guilt of watching her best friend cry, the guilt that someone still cared when Maya felt unworthy of care, the guilt that seemed to be the only emotion she could still feel. It was enough. Maya agreed. Once, just once. But as the days crept toward Thursday, she regretted that promise at least a dozen times. She invented excuses she didn't use. She rehearsed the text message canceling, her thumb hovering over send, but never pressing it. And when Thursday arrived, she stood outside the community center at 7:15, 15 minutes late on purpose, watching through the glass doors as a circle of strangers sat in plastic chairs, sharing their pain, like it was something that could be divided, and therefore diminished. This is a mistake, Maya thought, but her feet carried her inside anyway, pulled by a promise she couldn't break and a friend she couldn't disappoint. The door creaked when she opened it, and every head turned toward her, and Maya wanted to run, wanted to disappear, wanted to be anywhere but here in this fluorescent-lit room that smelled like coffee and sadness. But then her eyes met his. The facilitator, standing at the front of the circle, stopped mid-sentence when she entered. He was young, maybe late 20s, with dark hair and eyes that held something Maya recognized immediately. The kind of pain that doesn't show on the surface but lives deep in the bones. The kind of pain that comes from surviving something you're not sure you wanted to survive. He didn't smile at her with pity, or give her that sympathetic head tilt people always gave her now. He just nodded once, a simple acknowledgement, and gestured to an empty chair in the back. Maya sat, arms crossed defensively across her chest, building walls with her body language that screamed, "Don't talk to me. Don't see me. Don't try to fix me." The session continued. A woman in her 50s talked about losing her husband to cancer. A teenage boy talked about his best friend's overdose. An elderly man talked about his wife of 40 years, gone for 2, and how he still set the table for 2 every night. Maya listened, but didn't hear. She was too busy fighting the urge to bolt, too busy telling herself this was pointless, too busy noticing that the facilitator, Daniel, someone had called him, kept glancing her way, not intrusively, just where, like he could see through the walls she'd built, and understood why they were necessary. When the session ended, and people started gathering their coats and saying their goodbyes with the forced cheerfulness of people trying to prove they were healing, Maya stood and walked straight to the exit, but her feet betrayed her at the last second. She stopped in front of a bulletin board plastered with grief resources, hotlines and therapist numbers and book recommendations and support group schedules, and she stared at it like it held answers to questions she was too afraid to ask. She sensed him before she heard him, that awareness of another person's presence in your space. And when Daniel spoke, his voice was quiet, careful, without the patronizing. Gentleness she'd come to hate. "First time?" he asked, and there was no judgment in it, just recognition. Maya's defenses shot up immediately. "And probably my last," she said, her tone sharp enough to cut. "This isn't really my thing." She didn't look at him, kept her eyes fixed on a flyer about processing sudden loss, the words blurring together into meaningless shapes. Daniel didn't push, didn't try to convince her otherwise, didn't launch into some speech about the healing power of community. He just said, "That's okay. Everyone processes differently." It was such a simple statement, permission she didn't know she needed, and it made something crack inside her chest. You don't understand, Maya said, finally turning to face him, her eyes burning with unshed tears and years of accumulated pain compressed into 6 impossible months. Nobody duh. Daniel held her gaze, and in that moment, something passed between them. Something unspoken, but understood. A recognition of shared darkness that couldn't be faked or performed. You'd be surprised, he said quietly. And there was a weight to those words. A history, a story he wasn't telling, but that she could sense hovering just beneath the surface. Maya wanted to say something, wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to demand to know how he could possibly understand the specific hell of survivors' guilt and paralyzing grief and the suffocating weight of everyone's expectations, but the words wouldn't come. So she just stood there, searching his face for answers she couldn't articulate, and finding in his eyes a reflection of her own brokenness. She left without saying goodbye, pushed through the doors into the cool autumn night, and walked 3 blocks before she realized she was shaking. Not from cold, but from something else. Recognition, maybe, or hope, though that felt too dangerous to name. When Sarah texted asking how it went, Maya typed and deleted 4 different responses before settling on, "I'm going back next week." She didn't understand why she'd said it. Didn't understand what had changed in that brief conversation with a stranger who somehow didn't feel like a stranger. But as she lay in bed that night, 3 a.m. approaching like clockwork, Maya found herself thinking not about her parents or the accident or the guilt, but about Daniel's eyes and the way he'd said you'd be surprised, like he was offering her a map to a country he'd already survived. But here's what Maya didn't know yet. Sometimes the people who save us are the ones who need saving just as much. So was Daniel's story. What darkness was he carrying that made him recognize hers so easily? And could 2 broken people actually help each other heal? Or would they just shatter each other into even smaller pieces? Maya returned to that grief support group not because she believed it would help, but because she couldn't stop thinking about the man who had looked at her brokenness and hadn't flinched. The following Thursday, she arrived on time, and that small act of punctuality felt like a betrayal to the part of her that wanted to stay buried in grief forever. Daniel noticed immediately when she walked through those doors. She saw his eyes flicker with something she couldn't quite name, relief maybe, or recognition, and he nodded at her the same way he had before. No fanfare, no performance, just acknowledgement. Maya took the same seat in the back, arms still crossed, walls still firmly in place, but this time, when people shared their stories, she actually listened. She heard the woman whose husband died of cancer talk about how she'd finally donated his clothes last month and had cried for 3 days straight afterward. She heard the teenage boy admit he still texted his dead best friend's number sometimes, just to see the messages go unread. She heard the elderly man confess that he'd started talking to his wife's photograph like she could answer back, and sometimes, in the silence, he swore he could hear her voice. And Maya realized something terrifying. She wasn't alone in her particular brand of crazy. These people understood the insanity of grief, the way it made you do things that looked absurd from the outside, but felt like survival on the inside. When Daniel asked if anyone else wanted to share, his eyes swept the circle and landed on Maya for just a fraction of a second longer than everyone else. But he didn't call on her, didn't put her on the spot, just moved on when she stayed silent. That absence of pressure made her want to speak more than any amount of encouragement could have, but she wasn't ready. Not yet. Not when her voice still felt like it belonged to someone else. Someone who had died in that car crash, along with her parents, even though her body had stubbornly continued breathing. Week 2 became week 3, and Maya found herself arriving earlier each time, sitting a little closer to the circle, uncrossing her arms for longer periods. She started noticing things about Daniel that she hadn't seen that first night. The way he leaned forward when someone was struggling to find words, like he could physically bridge the gap between their pain and their ability to express it. The way he never looked at his phone during sessions, giving every person his complete attention like their story, was the only thing that mattered in the entire world. The way his voice softened when someone cried but never went syrupy with false comfort. He let pain be pain without trying to sugarcoat it or rush through it. And she noticed the way he held himself, that careful control, like he was a bomb that had learned to diffuse itself but could never quite forget what it felt like to explode. During the 4th week, Maya stayed after the session ended, pretending to read the bulletin board again. And Daniel approached her, just like he had that first night. "You keep coming back," he observed, and there was a question hidden in that statement, an invitation to explain why. Maya shrugged, still not quite ready to admit that she came back for him as much as for herself. "I guess it's less terrible than I expected," she said, aiming for casual and landing somewhere near vulnerable. Daniel smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes and made them crinkle at the corners, and Maya felt something shift in her chest, something that felt dangerously close to hope. "High praise," he said. "I'll take it." They stood there in comfortable silence for a moment, and Maya found herself wanting to ask him questions she had no right to ask. "What's your story? What made you become a grief counselor? Do you see me as just another broken person you need to fix?" But before she could form words, another group member interrupted to ask Daniel about next week's session, and the moment dissolved. By week 5, Maya had memorized the rhythm of these Thursday evenings. She knew that the coffee was always too strong and slightly burnt. She knew that David, the elderly widower, always arrived exactly 15 minutes early and sat in the same chair. She knew that Jennifer, the woman who'd lost her husband to cancer, always brought tissues, even though the center provided them. And she knew that Daniel always wore a watch that looked expensive, but was actually a cheap knockoff, because she'd seen the way the metal had started to tarnish around the edges. These small details anchored her, gave her something to focus on besides the enormity of her own grief. And somewhere in the accumulation of these tiny observations, Maya started to feel less like a ghost and more like a person who might eventually figure out how to be alive again. And then came the night everything changed. Week 5, session running long because David was having a particularly hard day. Tears streaming down his weathered face as he talked about how he'd accidentally thrown away his wife's shopping list last week, and had spent an hour digging through the trash to find it, because it was the last thing she'd ever written in her handwriting. The room was heavy with shared understanding, that collective knowledge that grief makes you do things that seem insane, but are actually the sanest response to an insane situation, and Maya felt something crack inside her. That carefully constructed dam she'd built to hold back 6 months of unsaid words and unfelt feelings. Before she could think better of it, before fear could stop her, she started speaking. "My parents died 6 months ago," Maya heard herself say, and the words felt foreign in her mouth, like was speaking a language she'd only just learned. Every eye in the circle turned toward her, but instead of feeling exposed, she felt held. Car accident. They were coming home from a family wedding. I wasn't in the car because I stayed behind to help clean up. Her voice cracked on the word clean, and she had to pause, had to swallow past the boulder lodging itself in her throat. Every single day, I wake up and think, why am I still here? Why did I get to live when they didn't? What makes my life more valuable than theirs? The words were pouring out now, unstoppable. 6 months of silence, breaking like a fever. They were good people, the best people. They loved everyone and everyone loved them. And I'm nobody. I'm nothing special. And they're gone, and I'm here. And it doesn't make any sense. She couldn't look at anyone as she spoke. Couldn't bear to see pity or judgment or worse. That particular brand of uncomfortable sympathy people gave when they didn't know what else to offer. But when she finally risked a glance up, she saw Daniel, and the expression on his face stopped her breath in her lungs. He wasn't looking at her with pity. He was looking at her like he was seeing himself, like her words were echoing something inside him that he'd tried to bury but had never quite managed to kill. His hands were gripping the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles had gone white, and there was a muscle jumping in his jaw like he was physically restraining himself from speaking, from interrupting, from breaking his own professional boundaries to tell her something he wasn't supposed to say. The session ended 20 minutes later, and people filed out with quiet goodbyes and gentle shoulder touches for Maya, that universal language of grief support that said, "I see you, I hear you, you're not alone." Maya stayed in her chair, emotionally exhausted, wrung out like a washcloth that had been twisted until there was nothing left. She expected Daniel to approach her with some therapeutic platitude, some professional statement about how brave she'd been to share, how speaking her truth was the first step to healing. All the things counselors were trained to say. But he didn't. He busied himself with cleaning up the coffee station, straightening chairs, avoiding her eyes, and Maya felt something like disappointment settle in her stomach. Had she hid too much? Had she scared him off with the intensity of her pain? Was she just another broken person in a long line of broken people he saw every week? Nothing special, nothing worth. "Thank you," Daniel's voice cut through her spiral of self-doubt. Quiet, but firm. He'd stopped moving, was standing 10 feet away with his back partially to her, like it was easier to say what he needed to say without looking directly at her. "For sharing. I know that wasn't easy." Maya waited, sensing there was more, sensing that these surface words were covering something deeper. Something Daniel was trying to decide whether to reveal. The silence stretched between them, taut as a wire. And just when Maya thought he wasn't going to say anything else, he turned to face her, and the look in his eyes was raw in a way she hadn't seen before. All his careful control stripped away to reveal the person underneath the counselor facade. "I understand more than you know," Daniel said, and there was a weight to those words that made Maya's heart start beating faster. The survivor's guilt, the "why am I still here?" questions, the feeling like you don't deserve to be alive when someone you loved isn't. He took a step closer, then seemed to think better of it, maintaining that professional distance even though everything about his posture screamed that he wanted to close the gap. "My younger sister died when I was 19. Suicide. I was away at college when it happened." The words came out clipped, practiced, like he'd said them before in his own therapy sessions. But they still hurt every single time. I had talked to her 3 days before. She seemed down, but I thought it was just normal teenage stuff. I didn't realize. His voice broke, and he had to pause, had to breathe, had to visibly pull himself back together. "I didn't realize she was planning to end her life, and I've spent the last 9 years wondering if I could have stopped it if I'd just paid more attention. If I'd just asked the right questions. If I'd just been there instead of being selfish and staying at school." Maya felt tears streaming down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. She stood up slowly, carefully, like she was approaching a wounded animal that might bolt if she moved too fast. "That's why you do this," she said, and it wasn't a question. The grief counseling. "You're trying to save everyone else because you couldn't save her." Daniel's laugh was bitter, hollow. "My therapist would be proud of how quickly you figured that out," he said. "Took me 3 years and a complete mental breakdown to get there." They stood there in the empty community center, the fluorescent lights humming above them, two broken people who had somehow found each other in the wreckage of their respective tragedies, and Maya felt something she hadn't felt in 6 months: connection. Real, genuine, terrifying connection with another human being who actually understood what it meant to be haunted by the people you couldn't save. "I should go," Daniel said, but he didn't move. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. That was unprofessional of me, sharing like that. I'm supposed to be the facilitator, not another participant." Maya shook her head, wiping at her tears with the back of her hand. "Don't apologize," she said fiercely. "You just gave me something no one else has been able to give me in 6 months. Proof that I'm not crazy. Proof that someone else understands." Daniel met her eyes, and the moment stretched between them, loaded with possibility and danger and the terrifying prospect of two people who'd spent so long in darkness, recognizing a potential light in each other. "Same time next week?" Maya asked. And Daniel nodded, relief flooding his features. "Same time next week," he confirmed. And when Maya walked out into the night, she felt different, lighter, like she'd shared the weight of her grief with someone who had strong enough shoulders to help her carry it. But what Maya didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Daniel would spend that entire night staring at his ceiling, terrified by what he'd just done, terrified by the feelings stirring inside him, terrified that he was crossing lines he'd sworn never to cross again. Because here's the thing about grief counselors. They're supposed to help people heal, not fall in love with them. So what happens when the lines between professional and personal start to blur? What happens when helping someone else becomes the very thing that saves you? Week 6 arrived, and the dynamic had shifted in ways both subtle and profound. Maya arrived early for the first time, finding Daniel already in the room setting up chairs, and they exchanged smiles that lasted a fraction of a second too long to be purely professional. During the session, Maya contributed more, sharing not just her pain, but also small victories. She'd gone through her parents' closet last week. She'd answered a call from an old friend. She'd driven past the bakery without having a panic attack. The group celebrated these tiny milestones because they understood that in grief, small victories are actually monumental achievements, and Maya felt genuinely proud of herself for the first time since the accident. But more than that, she felt seen by Daniel in a way that went beyond counselor and client, and every time their eyes met across the circle, she felt that connection deepening, becoming something neither of them was quite ready to name. After the session, they lingered again, and this time the pretense of reading the bulletin board or cleaning up had fallen away. They were staying because they wanted to talk to each other, and both of them knew it, and the awareness hung between them like electricity before a storm. "Coffee?" Daniel asked. And it was such a simple question, but it felt momentous, like they were standing at a crossroads and choosing a direction would mean there was no going back. Maya hesitated, knowing instinctively that saying yes would change things, would move them from the safe confines of the support group into something messier and more complicated. But she'd spent 6 months being careful, being safe, being dead while still breathing, and suddenly she wanted to be reckless. "Coffee," she agreed, And Daniel's smile was worth every risk she was taking. They went to a diner 3 blocks away, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee. That came in thick ceramic mugs, and a waitress who called everyone honorable without irony. They sat across from each other and talked for 2 hours, and it should have been awkward. This transition from group facilitator and participant to 2 people just existing in each other's space. But it wasn't. It felt natural, easy, like they'd been having these conversations for years instead of weeks. Daniel told her about dropping out of college after his sister died, about the year he spent barely functional, about how therapy had saved his life and inspired him to help others. Maya told him about growing up in the bakery, about how her parents had been her best friends, about how guilty she felt that she couldn't bring herself to reopen it even though she knew that's what they would have wanted. Maybe what they would have wanted matters less than what you need, Daniel said carefully, stirring his coffee, even though he'd already added sugar 5 minutes ago. Grief isn't about honoring the dead by destroying yourself. It's about figuring out how to carry them with you while still moving forward. Maya considered this, rolling the words around in her mind, like stones she was testing for weight. "Is that what you've done?" she asked. "Figured out how to carry your sister while moving forward?" Daniel's smile was sad, knowing some days better than others. He admitted, "There are still mornings I wake up and forget she's gone. Still moments where I pick up my phone to call her before I remember. Still dates, her birthday, the anniversary, where I can barely function." He met Maya's eyes, and there was honesty in his gaze that she'd rarely seen from anyone. "I don't think the pain ever fully goes away. I think you just get better at living alongside it." They left the diner at midnight, and Daniel walked Maya to her car, even though his was parked in the opposite direction. And when they said goodbye, there was a moment where neither of them moved, both standing in the parking lot under harsh fluorescent lights, close enough that Maya could smell his cologne and see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. She thought he might kiss her. She thought she might want him to. But he just squeezed her hand once, quickly, and said, "See you next week," and drove away, leaving Maya standing alone, with her heart beating too fast, and her mind spinning with possibilities she wasn't sure she was brave enough to pursue. Week 7, and they sat next to each other during the session for the first time, their chairs close enough that their knees occasionally brushed, and every accidental touch felt like lightning. Week 8, and they started texting between sessions. Nothing deep, just small check-ins. Funny memes about grief that only people who'd experienced loss would understand. Photos of things that reminded them of their lost loved ones. Week 9, and Maya showed Daniel the bakery, unlocking the door for the first time in months with shaking hands while he stood beside her, solid and steady, ready to catch her if she fell apart. They didn't go inside. She couldn't, not yet. But standing in the doorway was progress, and Daniel understood that without her having to explain. Week 10, and Daniel invited Maya to join him for something he'd never shared with anyone, his ritual of writing letters to his sister. They sat in a park at sunset, and he showed her the journal he'd kept for 9 years, filled with letters he'd never send, thoughts he'd never speak aloud, confessions of guilt and love and rage and hope all tangled together. Maya read one, her throat tight with emotion, and when she looked up at Daniel, she saw him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. "Thank you for trusting me with this," she whispered, and Daniel reached out and took her hand, properly this time, threading his fingers through hers. "Thank you for seeing me," he replied, and they sat like that until the sun disappeared completely, and the park lights flickered on. Two people who'd found each other in the darkness, learning how to be comfortable in the growing light. Week 11, and they went to dinner, and it felt like a date, even though neither of them called it that. And when Daniel walked Maya to her door, they stood there for 5 full minutes just talking, neither wanting the night to end. Week 12, and Daniel kissed her, finally, after a session where Maya had shared a breakthrough about being ready to consider reopening the bakery. It was soft and careful, a question more than a statement. And when Maya kissed him back, she felt something in her chest crack open, not breaking but opening, making room for possibilities she'd thought was dead and buried with her parents. But here's what they didn't see coming. Happiness after grief feels like betrayal. How dare they smile when their loved ones couldn't? How dare they find joy when death had stolen it from the people they'd lost? Is it possible to move forward without leaving the dead behind? And what happens when guilt becomes stronger than love? The next 2 weeks were a blur of stolen moments and careful boundaries. They were cautious, both aware that they were navigating dangerous territory. Daniel was still the facilitator of Maya's grief group, and there were ethical lines that shouldn't be crossed, professional boundaries that existed for good reasons. They didn't announce their relationship to the group. They kept their connection private, separate from the community center, existing in coffee shops and parks and quiet restaurants where no one knew them. It felt like a secret, which made it feel both more precious and more precarious, like they were building something beautiful on a foundation that could crack at any moment. Maya was healing, genuinely healing, in ways that had nothing to do with time and everything to do with connection. She started sleeping through the night more often. She called Sarah back and actually went out for drinks, laughing at jokes and contributing to conversations instead of just going through the motions. She began sorting through her parents' belongings, not to erase them, but to honor them, keeping things that mattered and letting go of things that didn't. She even started baking at home, small batches of bread that she'd leave on neighbors' doorsteps anonymously, testing the waters of returning to something that had once brought her joy. And Daniel was different, too. The careful control he usually maintained had softened. He smiled more easily. He talked about his sister without that haunted look taking over his entire face. He started making plans for the future beyond just the next support group session, talking about maybe writing a book about grief someday, maybe expanding his private practice, maybe. Words that implied forward motion instead of standing still in the wreckage of the past. They were healing each other, not by fixing what was broken, but by accepting it, by loving each other's scars instead of trying to pretend they didn't exist. But recovery is never linear, and happiness borrowed from grief always demands payment. It started small, Maya having a bad day, where everything reminded her of her parents, and she couldn't get out of bed. Daniel talking her through it over the phone, but feeling helpless because he couldn't physically be there, couldn't hold her while she cried, couldn't make it better. Then Maya having a panic attack in the bakery doorway when she tried to go inside again, hyperventilating so badly Daniel had to coach her breathing through the phone, while sitting in a therapy session with another client, torn between his professional obligations and his personal desperation to help the woman he was falling in love with. Small cracks appearing in the foundation they'd built, hairline fractures that seemed manageable until they weren't. Week 14 brought the first real warning. Daniel's supervisor at the community center, a woman named Patricia who'd been doing grief work for 30 years and had seen every possible boundary violation, called him into her office after a session. "I need to talk to you about Maya," Patricia said. And Daniel's heart sank because he knew. He'd known this conversation was coming eventually, had been dreading it since the first time he'd kissed Maya outside her apartment. Patricia was gentle but firm. "I've noticed you two arriving together, leaving together. The way you look at each other. Daniel, I understand connection happens, especially in grief. Work where emotions are heightened, but you know the rules. She's a member of your group. You're in a position of power. This crosses ethical lines that exist for very good reasons." Daniel wanted to argue, wanted to explain that what he and Maya had was different, was real, was built on genuine understanding and not some transference of grief or power dynamic exploitation. But he couldn't, because Patricia was right. The rules existed to protect vulnerable people from being taken advantage of, and even though Daniel knew his intentions were pure, knew that Maya was healing and their relationship was helping, not hurting, the fact remained that he'd violated professional boundaries, that he'd sworn to uphold. "You have two choices," Patricia said, her voice softening with genuine sympathy. "You refer Maya to another counselor and step back completely until she's no longer in any group you facilitate. Or you continue seeing her, but you leave this position. I can't have a facilitator who's romantically involved with a group member. It compromises everything we're trying to build here." Daniel agreed to think about it, but as he drove home that night, his mind was chaos. The support group wasn't just his job. It was his purpose, his way of honoring his sister, his method of turning his own tragedy into something meaningful. But Maya wasn't just a woman he was dating. She was the first person in 9 years who'd made him feel like he could build a life that included more than just grief work and surviving. How could he choose between his purpose and his person? How could he sacrifice one without losing essential pieces of himself? He decided not to tell Maya immediately. He'd figure it out, find a solution that let him keep both. But that decision, that choice to keep a secret, even with good intentions, was the first domino that would eventually bring everything crashing down. Because secrets in relationships built on shared pain and hard-won honesty are grenades with slow-burning fuses, harmless until they're not. Meanwhile, Maya was facing her own crisis. The bakery's lease was up for renewal, and the landlord needed an answer within 2 weeks. Sign a new lease, sell the property, or walk away and let it go to someone else. For months, Maya had been able to avoid making this decision, had been able to exist in limbo where the bakery was neither open nor closed, neither honored nor abandoned. But now she had to choose, and the weight of that choice was crushing. Her parents had poured their lives into that bakery. Selling it felt like erasing them, but reopening it felt impossible, terrifying, like stepping into shoes she could never fill, and closing it permanently felt like admitting they were really gone, like accepting a finality she wasn't ready to accept. She tried to talk to Daniel about it, but he was distracted, distant in ways he hadn't been before, and Maya could sense something was wrong but didn't know how to ask without sounding needy or paranoid. The texts became less frequent. The phone calls shorter. When they did see each other, Daniel seemed preoccupied, like part of him was somewhere else, wrestling with something he wouldn't share. Maya felt the distance growing between them like a chasm opening slowly beneath their feet, and the old familiar fear came rushing back. Everyone leaves, everyone dies or disappears. You're meant to be alone. Don't get comfortable, because happiness is temporary, and pain is the only constant. Week 15, and everything fell apart in the span of 48 hours. First, Maya received the final notice from the landlord. Decision required in 1 week, or the property would be listed for sale. Second, Daniel's supervisor sent an official email stating that he needed to make a decision about his position by the end of the month. Third, and most devastatingly, one of the longtime members of the support group approached Maya after a session with concern in her eyes and said, "I don't want to overstep, but I've noticed you and Daniel have gotten close. Just be careful." The last facilitator who got involved with a group member ended up losing his license and breaking her heart. I'd hate to see history repeat itself. Maya felt the bottom drop out of her world. She'd been so focused on her own healing, so caught up in the bubble of her relationship with Daniel, that she hadn't considered the larger implications, the potential consequences, the ways their connection could hurt Daniel professionally, or put her in a position where she was unknowingly causing harm. That night, she called Daniel, and for the first time, they fought. Not yelling, not screaming, but that cold, careful fighting that couples do when they're both terrified of saying what they really mean. Maya demanded to know what was going on, why he'd been distant, whether she was causing problems for him. Daniel deflected, said everything was fine, claimed he was just stressed about work, refused to share the ultimatum Patricia had given him because he didn't want to burden Maya or make her feel guilty for something that wasn't her fault. But his refusal to be honest felt like rejection. It felt like every other time someone had pulled away from Maya, every friend who'd stopped calling after her parents died because they didn't know what to say, every distant relative who'd sent a sympathy card but never followed up. It felt like abandonment, and Maya's grief brain, still fragile despite months of healing, interpreted it as proof that she'd been right all along. She didn't deserve happiness, didn't deserve love, didn't deserve to move forward when her parents couldn't. "I can't do this," Maya said, her voice breaking. "I can't be with someone who won't let me in, who won't trust me with the truth. I've had enough of people treating me like I'm too broken to handle reality." Daniel tried to explain, tried to backtrack, but the damage was done. Maya hung up, and for the first time since they'd started whatever this was, she didn't answer when he called back. The next day, Maya made a decision. She called the landlord and told him to list the bakery for sale. She called Sarah and said she was thinking about moving to a different city, starting over somewhere without ghosts on every corner. She stopped answering Daniel's calls and texts, deleted the support group from her calendar, decided that trying to heal had been a mistake and that maybe she was meant to live in grief forever, because every time she tried to climb out, something dragged her back down. Daniel, meanwhile, was spiraling. He'd gone to Patricia and told her he was choosing Maya, that he'd give up his position at the community center. But Patricia informed him it wasn't that simple. There would need to be an ethics review, a formal process, documentation proving the relationship hadn't begun while Maya was in his group even though it had, potential consequences that could affect his entire career. And now Maya wasn't speaking to him, and he didn't know how to fix it without violating her boundary of giving her space, and he was terrified that by trying to protect her from the complexity of the situation, he'd lost her entirely. This is the moment every healing person fears, the moment when progress feels like a lie, and relapse feels like truth. Can two broken people actually build something whole, or will their jagged edges just cut each other until there's nothing left? What happens when the person helping you heal becomes the person you need to heal from? Week 16, and Maya was standing outside the closed bakery at 2 a.m, keys in her shaking hand, staring at the door she'd been unable to open for months, feeling more alone than she'd felt since the night her parents died. Her phone was full of missed calls from Daniel, voicemails she hadn't listened to, texts she'd read but not answered. In her other hand was an email from a potential buyer who wanted to turn the bakery into a trendy coffee shop. erasing every trace of her parents' legacy and replacing it with reclaimed wood and overpriced lattes. She had to respond by morning. She had to make a choice. And she'd never felt less capable of choosing anything in her entire life. She tried the key in the lock, thinking maybe if she could just go inside, just face this one fear, it would give her clarity about everything else. But her hand was shaking too badly, and the key wouldn't turn, and she started crying, those ugly, gasping sobs that come from the deepest part of your chest where you've buried all the pain you can't process. She slid down the door until she was sitting on the cold concrete, keys clenched in her fist, and pulled out her phone. She didn't want to call Daniel. Calling him felt like admitting she needed him, and needing people had only ever led to pain. But her fingers moved without permission, muscle memory from weeks of him being her person, and the phone was ringing before she could stop herself. He didn't answer. The call went to voicemail, and Maya felt something inside her shatter completely, because of course he didn't answer. Of course he'd finally given up. Of course she'd pushed away the one person who understood. And now she was truly, completely, irreversibly alone. She ended the call without leaving a message, dropped the phone beside her, and let herself break open entirely, crying for her parents and for Daniel and for the version of herself who'd briefly believed she could be happy again. But what Maya didn't know, what she couldn't have known because she'd hung up too quickly, was that Daniel hadn't answered because he was already in his car, already driving toward her, already on his way because he'd been parked outside her apartment for the last hour, trying to work up the courage to knock on her door. And he'd seen her location share. She'd never turned it off, and noticed she was at the bakery. And he knew something was wrong. Sometimes the people we push away are the ones running toward us the fastest. Sometimes asking for help feels like weakness, until you realize it's actually the bravest thing you can do. But would Daniel get there in time? And even if he did, could they bridge the gap that had opened between them? Or was this the end? Maya didn't know how long she'd been sitting there when she heard footsteps, rapid and purposeful. And then Daniel was there, dropping to his knees beside her, pulling her into his arms without asking permission, and Maya collapsed into him, soaking his shirt with tears and not caring, because he was there, he'd come, he hadn't given up. "I'm sorry," Daniel said into her hair, his own voice rough with emotion. "I'm so sorry. I should have told you everything. I should have trusted you with the truth. I was trying to protect you, and I just made everything." Whirr! Maya pulled back enough to look at him, and in the harsh streetlight, she could see that he'd been crying too, that his eyes were red-rimmed and exhausted, that he looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Why didn't you tell me?" Maya asked, and Daniel took a shaky breath. "Because I was scared," he admitted. "Scared that if you knew being with me could hurt my career, you'd leave to protect me. Scared that you'd think you were a burden or a problem. Scared that I'd lose you if you knew how complicated this was. But I realize now that by trying to protect you from complexity, I just made you feel shut out and alone. And that's the exact opposite of what I wanted." He cupped her face in his hands, thumbs wiping away tears. "I've made a choice, Maya. I'm leaving the community center. I'm choosing you. Not because you asked me to, not because I have to, but because I want to. Because you're not a complication or a problem. You're the best thing that's happened to me in 9 years. And I'm not letting you go without a fight." Maya felt something crack open in her chest again. That same sensation she'd felt when Daniel first kissed her, but deeper this time, more permanent. "I tried to go inside," she whispered, gesturing at the bakery door. I wanted to be brave, but I couldn't do it. Daniel looked at the building, then back at her. You don't have to be brave alone, he said. That's what I've been trying to tell you. That's what you've taught me. We don't have to carry our grief separately anymore. He stood up and offered her his hand. Want? Try together? Maya hesitated, fear warring with hope, but then she thought about everything they'd already survived, separately and together, and she realized that maybe brave wasn't about not being scared. Maybe brave was about being terrified, and doing it anyway, especially when you had someone standing beside you willing to be terrified with you. She took Daniel's hand and let him pull her to her feet. Together, they approached the door. Together, Maya fit the key into the lock. Together, they turned it, and the door swung open into darkness that had been sealed for 6 months, and Maya stepped inside for the first time since her parents died. And Daniel stepped inside with her, and they stood in the dark bakery that smelled like dust and memories and possibility. And Maya started crying again, but this time it felt different. Felt like release instead of drowning. Felt like maybe, just maybe, she could do this after all. They didn't turn on the lights. They just stood there in the darkness, holding hands. And Daniel said, "Tell me about them. Your parents. Not the grief, not the accident. Tell me who they were." And Maya did. She told him about her father's terrible jokes, and her mother's perfect pie crust, and the way they'd dance in the kitchen when they thought no one was watching. She told him about growing up surrounded by flour and love, about learning to knead dough before she learned to ride a bike, about the regular customers who were like extended family. She talked until her voice went hoarse, and Daniel listened to every word. And somewhere in the telling, the bakery stopped feeling like a tomb and started feeling like what it had always been, a place where people came together, where love was baked into every loaf, where community was built one meal at a time. When they finally left, hours later, the sun was starting to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and Maya felt exhausted, but also, strangely, hopeful. She still had to make a decision about the bakery. Daniel still had to deal with the consequences of leaving his position. They still had a mountain of complications to navigate and healing to do. But they would do it together, and that made all the difference. "What happens now?" Maya asked as they stood by their cars, neither wanting to leave, neither ready to face the day ahead, but knowing they had to. Daniel smiled, tired but genuine. "Now we figure it out," he said, "one day at a time, one decision at a time." Together, he kissed her forehead, tender and full of promise. "And Maya, whatever you decide about the bakery, keep it, sell it, reopen it, turn it into something completely different. I'm with you. There's no wrong choice as long as it's yours." Maya drove home as the city woke up around her. And for the first time in 6 months, she felt something that resembled peace. Not happiness, not yet, but peace. The kind that comes from knowing you're not alone, from knowing that healing is possible even when it's painful, from knowing that love after loss isn't betrayal but honor, isn't forgetting but remembering in a way that lets you keep living. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't know what the next chapter would bring. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was ready to stop surviving and start living, whatever that meant, wherever that led. But the hardest test was still coming. Because making the choice to heal is one thing. Actually doing it, when everything falls apart, is something else entirely. And sometimes, just when you think you've found your way out of the darkness, Life has one more blow to deliver. So what would break them? And more importantly, what would prove they were stronger than their breaking points? Here's the truth about healing that no one tells you. The moment you decide to choose life over grief is the exact moment the universe tests whether you really mean it. Maya spent the next 40 to 8 hours in a fog of decision-making that felt both monumental and impossible. She sat at her kitchen table with spreadsheets and financial projections, with memories and fear, with Daniel's voice in fear, her head saying there's no wrong choice as long as it's yours, and her own voice whispering back, but what if there is? The bakery lease renewal papers sat in front of her, deadline looming like a guillotine, and every time she picked up the pen to sign, her hand froze. Keep it, and fail to honor her parents' legacy by running it poorly. Sell it and erase them from the neighborhood they'd loved. Close it permanently and admit they were really, truly, never coming back, gone. Every option felt like a different flavor of loss, and Maya was so tired of losing. Meanwhile, Daniel was fighting his own battles. He'd submitted his resignation to the community center, effective in 2 weeks, and the fallout was more complicated than he'd anticipated. Patricia had been understanding but firm. There would still need to be an ethics review, still paperwork documenting the timeline of his relationship with Maya, still potential marks on his professional record that could affect future opportunities. His colleagues were divided, some supportive and others disappointed, whispering in break rooms about boundaries and judgment and how grief work attracts people who haven't fully processed their own trauma. Daniel heard the whispers and felt the weight of them, the implication that maybe he'd become a counselor not to help others, but to avoid helping himself. And maybe there was truth in that he didn't want to examine too closely. But then he'd think about Maya, about the way she'd cried in his arms outside the bakery, about the courage it took for her to even try the key in the lock. And he knew with bone-deep certainty that loving her wasn't a mistake, or an ethical violation, or a symptom of unprocessed grief. It was the first truly right thing he'd done since his sister died, the first choice he'd made for himself instead of in service to his guilt. And even if it cost him professionally, even if he had to rebuild his career from scratch, she was worth it. They were worth it. The possibility of building something real together was worth every risk. 3 days after their breakthrough at the bakery, Maya called Daniel at 11 at night, her voice small and scared in a way he hadn't heard since those early support group sessions. "I need you to be honest with me about something," she said. And Daniel, heart clenched, because that tone never preceded easy questions. "Did you leave the community center because you wanted to, or because I forced you to by being too broken, too complicated, too much?" The question hung between them like a knife, sharp and potentially lethal, and Daniel knew his answer would determine everything that came next. "Maya, listen to me," Daniel said, his voice steady and sure. "I didn't leave because of you. I left for you. There's a difference. One implies obligation and sacrifice. The other implies choice and commitment. I chose you. I chose us. I chose the possibility of building a life that includes more than just managing my grief through work. And yes, the situation was complicated. Yes, there were professional consequences, but you didn't force anything. You gave me permission to want something for myself again, and that's a gift, not a burden." He paused, letting the words sink in. "The question isn't whether I regret my choice. The question is whether you believe me enough to let yourself be chosen." Maya was quiet for a long moment, and Daniel could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, could imagine her sitting in her apartment processing his words the way she processed everything, carefully, thoroughly, looking for the trap or the lie or the inevitable disappointment. Finally, she spoke, her voice stronger than before. "I want to reopen the bakery," she said, and it wasn't what Daniel expected to hear, but somehow it made perfect sense. "Not alone. I can't do it alone. But I think maybe with help, with time, I could turn it into something that honors my parents without trying to be them. Something that's mine, but also theirs. Does that make sense?" Daniel felt pride swell in his chest, fierce and bright. "It makes perfect sense," he said. "And for what it's worth, I make terrible bread, but I'm excellent at math and customer service. So, if you need a business partner, I'm available." Maya laughed, a real laugh that carried hope instead of hysteria, and said, "Let me think about it. But Daniel, thank you for choosing me, for believing I was worth choosing." They stayed on the phone for another hour, talking about nothing and everything, making plans and dream building the way people do when they're starting to believe the future might actually be survivable. And when they finally hung up, both of them slept better than they had in weeks. The next morning, Maya signed the lease renewal papers with shaking hands and immediately called Sarah, who screamed so loudly Maya had to hold the phone away from her ear. "I'm reopening the bakery," Maya announced, and saying it out loud made it real in a way that signing papers hadn't. "I need help. I need time. I need to figure out how to do this without falling apart. But I'm doing it." Sarah was crying happy tears, promising to help however she could, already making plans and talking about grand reopening parties and social media. Marketing, and Maya felt overwhelmed but also held, reminded that she had people who loved her, who'd been waiting patiently for her to find her way back to life. But here's where the story could have ended neatly, where Maya and Daniel could have ridden off into their complicated but hopeful sunset, and we could have all felt satisfied that broken people can heal and love conquers grief. Except life doesn't work that way, does it? Because the universe has a way of testing our resolve right when we think we've figured everything out. And the question isn't whether the test will come, it's whether we'll pass it when it does. 1 week before the bakery's planned soft opening, 1 week before Maya was supposed to prove to herself and the world that she could do this, she had the worst panic attack she'd experienced since the early days after her parents' death. It came out of nowhere while she was standing in the bakery kitchen, flour on her hands and dough under her fingernails, exactly where she'd stood 1,000 times as a child watching her parents work. The memories crashed over her like a wave, her mother's laugh, her father's gentle corrections, the warmth and safety and love that had filled this space, and suddenly she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't remember why she'd thought she could possibly do this. She called Daniel because he was the only person who wouldn't tell her it was going to be okay, or that she was being irrational, or that she'd come so far and couldn't give up now. He just said, "I'm coming," and hung up. And 15 minutes later, was there, not trying to fix her or calm her down, just sitting on the kitchen floor beside her while she cried and hyperventilated and said, "I can't do this," over and over like a broken prayer. Daniel didn't argue. He didn't give her a pep talk. He just held her hand and said, "Okay, so what do you want to do instead?" The question surprised Maya enough that her breathing slowed slightly. What did she want? Not what should she do. Not what would her parents want. Not what made logical sense. But what did she actually want? "I want them back," she whispered. The truest answer she could give. "I want to walk upstairs and find them waiting for me. I want to tell them I'm sorry for not being in the car." I want one more conversation, one more hug, one more chance to say, I love you. Daniel nodded, squeezing her hand. I know, he said softly. I want that for you too. And I want it for me with my sister. But we can't have that. So what do you want that's actually possible? Maya thought about it, really thought about it, sitting on the cold kitchen floor of her parents' bakery with the man who understood her grief better than anyone else alive. I want to stop feeling guilty for being alive, she finally said. I want to remember them, without it destroying me. I want to build something here that makes them proud, but doesn't require me to be them. I want to prove that their love didn't die with them, that it lives on in me and in this place, and in everyone who walks through that door. She looked at Daniel, tears still streaming down her face, but her voice steady. I want to choose life, really choose it. Not just survive, but actually live. Is that possible? Can I do that? Daniel smiled, and there was so much love in his expression that Maya felt it like a physical warmth spreading through her chest. You're already doing it, he said. Every time you show up here, even though it's terrifying. Every time you try again after breaking down. Every time you let me in instead of pushing me away. That's choosing life, Maya. It's not a one-time decision. It's 1,000 tiny choices you make every single day. And some days you'll choose well, and some days you'll choose poorly. But as long as you keep choosing, you're winning. He stood up and offered her his hand for what felt like the 100th time in their relationship, and Maya took it for what felt like the 100th time. And they stood together in the kitchen that held so much pain and so much possibility. Help me bake, Maya said suddenly. Right now. Help me make one loaf of bread. Just one. If I can do that, maybe I can do the rest. So they did. Daniel pulled up a recipe on his phone because he'd been secretly watching bread-making tutorials for weeks, wanting to surprise Maya, but also wanting to understand this thing that was so central to her identity and her grief. Maya walked him through the steps with muscle memory that lived deeper than conscious thought, her hands knowing what to do even when her mind was chaos. And together they measured and mixed and kneaded and shaped. They talked while they worked, about nothing important and everything important, about Daniel's new plans for private practice and Maya's ideas for the bakery menu, and whether they were moving too fast or not fast enough, or exactly the right speed for two people who'd found each other in the wreckage of loss. When the bread came out of the oven 90 minutes later, golden and steaming and imperfect but real, Maya cried again, but this time the tears felt different. Cleansing, like something toxic, was finally leaving her body after 6 months of festering. She and Daniel sat at the corner table where she'd done homework as a child, the same table her parents had sat at during slow afternoons, and they tore the bread apart with their hands and ate it plain, no butter or jam needed. Just the simple perfection of flour and water and yeast, transformed by heat into something sustaining and good. I can do this, Maya said, and this time she believed it. I can actually do this. The soft opening happened exactly as planned 1 week later. Just a small gathering of friends and neighbors who'd known her parents, who'd missed the bakery, who wanted to support Maya in this terrifying act of courage, disguised as a business reopening. Daniel worked the register while Maya stayed in the kitchen, and Sarah handled the front tables, and together they made it work despite a dozen small disasters: bread that burned, coffee that spilled, a cash register that refused to cooperate. But nobody cared about the imperfections because they understood what this really was, not just a bakery reopening, but a woman choosing to live again, publicly and vulnerably, in a space that held all her grief and all her love tangled together. At the end of the night, after the last customer left, and the door was locked, and they were cleaning up the flour and the dishes and the beautiful mess of a day well lived, Maya found Daniel in the kitchen leaning against the counter, looking exhausted and happy. She walked up to him and kissed him, properly, deeply, with gratitude and love and hope, all mixed together. "Thank you," she whispered against his lips, "for showing up, for staying, for believing I could do this, even when I didn't believe it myself." Daniel pulled her closer, resting his forehead against hers. "Thank you for letting me," he replied. "Thank you for teaching me that helping others can also mean letting them help you. Thank you for being brave enough to choose life, even when it's terrifying." 3 months later, the bakery was thriving in a way Maya never could have imagined. She'd renamed it Second Rising after the bread-making term, for when dough gets another chance to grow after being punched down, and the name resonated with everyone who walked through the door. People who'd experienced loss, people who were rebuilding, people who understood that life is about rising again and again, no matter how many times you get knocked down. The walls displayed photos of her parents, alongside photos of customers and community, a visual reminder that love doesn't end with death, but transforms and continues through the people left behind. Maya had hired 2 part-time bakers, giving herself permission to not do everything alone, and Daniel had indeed become her unofficial business partner, handling the administrative side while building his private practice in an office upstairs. They still had hard days. Days when Maya couldn't go into the kitchen without crying. Days when Daniel woke up from nightmares about his sister and needed to be held until the ghosts receded. Days when grief hit them both like a surprise punch to the gut, and they had to remember how to breathe through it. But they had more good days than bad days now, and the good days were starting to feel like the norm rather than the exception. And that shift from grief being the default to grief being visitor felt like the truest measure of healing either of them had experienced. On a Thursday evening exactly 1 year after Maya first walked into that support group, she and Daniel stood in the bakery after closing, the smell of fresh bread lingering in the air, the city visible through the windows painted gold by the setting sun. "I was thinking," Maya said, arranging day-old pastries into a box for the homeless shelter pickup, "about how I spent 6 months thinking my life ended when my parents died, thinking I'd died with them, even though I was still breathing." She paused, meeting Daniel's eyes across the counter. "But I was wrong. I didn't die. I just got lost for a while. And you helped me find my way back." Daniel walked around the counter and pulled her into his arms, and they stood there swaying slightly, dancing without music in the kitchen, where Maya's parents had danced without knowing their daughter was watching. "We helped each other find our way back," Daniel corrected gently. "That's the thing about grief. It's not a journey you take alone unless you choose to be alone. And we chose each other. We chose to carry our pain together instead of separately. And that made all the difference." Maya looked around the bakery, at the business they'd built together, at the life they were creating from the ashes of everything they'd lost, and she felt something she hadn't felt in over a year: genuine, uncomplicated happiness. Not the kind that ignores pain or pretends tragedy didn't happen, but the kind that acknowledges suffering and chooses joy anyway. The kind that honors the dead by living fully. The kind that transforms grief into something that looks surprisingly like gratitude. "I think my parents would be proud," she whispered, and Daniel kissed her temple and replied, "I know they would be. And I think my sister would be proud too. Proud that we figured out how to keep living when it would have been easier to just keep surviving." They locked up the bakery and walked out into the evening hand in hand, Two people who'd been broken by loss and put back together by love. Not perfectly, but authentically. Not without scars, but with the wisdom that scars are proof you survived something that tried to destroy you. The city moved around them, indifferent to their small miracle of healing. And that was okay, because healing isn't meant to be a public performance. It's meant to be a private revolution, one choice at a time, one day at a time, one moment of courage at a time. And Maya and Daniel were living proof that grief doesn't have to be the end of your story. It can be the beginning of a new chapter written in your own words, on your own terms, with people who love you enough to help you hold the pen. So here's my question for you. Have you ever lost something so profound that you forgot how to live without it? Have you ever met someone who understood your pain in ways that words couldn't capture? Have you ever had to choose between staying safe in your grief or risking your heart on the possibility of healing? Because Maya and Daniel's story isn't just about romance or loss. It's about the courage it takes to keep choosing life, even when death has touched everything you love. It's about finding someone who meets you in your darkness, instead of demanding you find the light alone. It's about proving that broken people can build beautiful things if they're willing to be brave together. Drop a comment below and tell me, what would you have done in Maya's position? Would you have reopened the bakery or sold it? Would you have let Daniel in or kept him at a distance? And have you ever experienced a loss that changed everything? Let's talk about it. Let's share our stories, because that's what Maya and Daniel taught us. That healing happens in community, that speaking our pain makes it smaller, that we're never as alone as grief makes us feel. So comment below, share your story, and let's prove that even in our darkest moments, connection is possible. And if this story touched you, if it reminded you that healing is possible even when it seems impossible, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who needs to hear that they're not alone in their grief. Because stories like this, stories about rising from the ashes, about choosing life after loss, about loving again after devastation, these are the stories that save us when we're drowning. Let's keep telling them. Together,